Thank you for tuning in to part 2 of my presentation on modern technology and aging populations. The American Association for the Advancement of Science using fMRI scans found that the ventral striatum, a region of the brain associated with rewards, is much more activated in people who are not lonely. And that is demonstrated in the figure at the bottom. That yellow dot and the orange dots that you see there are activations of someone who is not lonely, someone who has a good social network, and perceives himself to be connected. That's the actual activations that come up showing brain activity on an fMRI scan. The temporoparietal junction is a region associated with taking the perspective of another person. This is much less activated among lonely people than in the non-lonely. This is important because this is how we are empathetic with others. And being empathetic is important in communication, in learning, in every social aspect that we encounter. Empathy is a very important part of functioning correctly and perception. So trying to teach somebody a new thing or trying to communicate with somebody who has deteriorating empathy could be difficult, and it could serve as a challenge for making a social bond or trying to help somebody learn a new thing. Very important. The English longitudinal study of aging using the Cox Proportional Hazards Regression Study assessed social isolation in terms of contact with family, friends, and participation in civic organizations and activities. Results from that study concluded that mortality rates were empirically higher among socially isolated individuals or those who perceived they were lonely. Using the Cox Proportional Hazards Regression Study, the English longitudinal study of aging found that 918 or 14% of 6,500 participants had died by the census date, with a higher rate among men than women at 16.3% versus 12.3%. Both social isolation and loneliness were associated with all-cause mortality. The absolute proportions of death were 21.9% versus 12% in the high-low average isolation groups and 19.2% versus 13.0% in the high and low average loneliness groups. This is basically saying that through this study, there was a higher rate of mortality with people who were lonely or perceived lonely or isolated. The National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project has identified multiple variables related to social isolation that create health risks to aging adults that live alone, have small social networks, and experience feelings of loneliness or perceived lack of social support. Health risks that were associated with feelings of loneliness or perceived lack of social support were obesity, tobacco abuse, alcohol abuse, high blood pressure, and diabetes. Here's a short video about Alzheimer's disease.
One disease, millions of lives permanently disrupted. Today, there are over 5 million Americans living with Alzheimer's disease. But Alzheimer's is taking more than memories. It's taking lives. What few realize is that Alzheimer's kills more people than breast cancer and prostate cancer combined. And Alzheimer's is the only disease in the top 10 causes of death that can be slowed, stopped, or prevented. From 2000 to 2013, while deaths from other diseases decreased significantly, Alzheimer's deaths increased 71%. But equally disturbing, many living with Alzheimer's say they are not being told their diagnosis. While more than 90% of people with the most common types of cancer say they are told their diagnosis, only 45% of people with Alzheimer's or their caregivers say they are told. The economic toll is staggering too. In 2015, it will cost the nation $226 billion to care for people with Alzheimer's. By 2030, 72 million baby boomers will reach an age of greater risk. The fact is, everyone's at risk for Alzheimer's, even you. But everyone can help, especially you. We're the Alzheimer's Association, the brains behind saving yours. Join us.
Okay, that was just a short video by the Alzheimer's Association that gave some statistics on Alzheimer's disease. The video did say that it is the 6th leading cause of death in the United States today. I want to start by asking, what is dementia? Dementia is a degenerative illness that affects the human brain. The human brain begins to shrink, neurons begin to die, and twisted accumulations of proteins called tangles form. Abnormal amounts of dead nerve cells also accumulate in the brain called plaque. If you look to the left, you'll see a figure of a brain tangle. Here's where you'll see in the diagram pointing to the healthy area, you'll see nerve cells that are much more concentrated. There's more of them in that area, and they're much more uniform. The lines are straighter. There's no breaks in the lines. This is a healthy area where there aren't any tangles. If you look to the bottom, you'll see it's less uniform. Things seem to be more intertwined or linked, like chain link if you look closely. There's also voids in that. That's a brain tangle. This is a major contributor to Alzheimer's disease. If you look to the right, you'll see in the PET scan, you'll see the APOE4 positive. That glowing material that you'll see there is plaque. That's an accumulation of dead brain cells. So to the left, you'll see the accumulation of the brain cells, dead brain cells that are collected. And the one to the right, there isn't any plaque on the brain at that point, so you don't see any accumulation or collection of dead nerve. Are dementia and Alzheimer's disease the same? Yes and no. Dementia refers to decline in neural function due to aging or lifestyle variables that contribute to the degeneration of the human brain. I always was under the impression that dementia was just a symptoms or a byproduct of Alzheimer's disease, but that's not true. Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia, so there are many different types of dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the most prevalent. At the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center, a total of 823 older persons free of dementia and enrollment were recruited from senior citizen facilities in and around Chicago. Loneliness was assessed at death. A uniform post-mortem examination of the brain was conducted to quantify if Alzheimer's disease pathology was present in multiple brain regions as well as cerebral infarctions. So what they were trying to do is they were trying to assess to see if loneliness was an actual pathology that left a signature on the brain. Although in postmortem results, loneliness did not quantify AD pathology in multiple brain regions or the presence of cerebral infarctions, 76 subjects did develop clinical Alzheimer's disease. Based on results, risk of Alzheimer's disease was more than doubled in lonely persons in the 90th percentile compared with persons who were not lonely. They only scored in the 10th percentile. The American Association for the Advancement of Science uses fMRI scans to evaluate the connection between social isolation and neural activity. Research has found that parts of the brain are more active with people who are connected to a social system, and how lonelier individuals experience less activation in regions of the brain when isolated or perceived to be lonely. Behavioral Medicine Research Center and the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences from Duke University conducted a study stating that social isolation has been linked to poor survival in patients with coronary artery disease, or CAD. Social isolation was examined as a predictor of mortality in 430 patients with significant CAD. More isolated patients were compared with their less isolated counterparts on factors that might help explain the association between isolation and survival. The mortality rate was much higher among isolated individuals. Those with 3 or fewer people in their social support network had a relative risk for cardiac mortality. Loneliness, however, did not contribute to worsening conditions on the actual disease, but did contribute to a higher risk of death. Now again, just like we were talking with Alzheimer's disease, loneliness did not create a pathology or leave a signature in cardiac testing, but it again was a major factor in mortality. So something's happening here, that there's things being activated in the brain based on loneliness that is contributing to mortality in people suffering from coronary artery disease and Alzheimer's. It's not worsening their condition. It's not worsening the actual disease, but it is a major risk factor in death with people who have these diseases. In evaluating the materials I have researched, I've concluded that technology is a risk factor to aging populations. Isolation and perceived loneliness did not empirically contribute to worsening coronary artery disease or Alzheimer's disease. However, it did empirically contribute to mortality rates in both populations, as well as links to health issues. So again, they didn't worsen the actual coronary artery disease or worsen Alzheimer's disease, but they were major contributors to mortality rates in these populations. What I found most interesting about this research is that self-isolation and loneliness do not contribute to the decline of actual disease, however, does activate parts of the brain that contributes to mortality. So something activates in our brain when we are perceived to be lonely or self-isolated that begins to shut down the human body with people who are suffering from the multiple diseases, I'm sure, but in this case, coronary artery disease and Alzheimer's disease. In tying this into theories from our readings in the class, I want to speak briefly about disengagement theory and activity theory. Disengagement theory talks about how older populations disconnect from society. And it states that when older populations disconnect from society, that's a part of aging, which isn't necessarily true. I'm sure many aging populations would really like to evolve with emerging technology. Activity theory discusses how it's not necessarily normal for people to want to disengage or to be disengaged. This is important because it shows that people are thinking of, why is this a problem? If these people don't want to be disengaged, why are they being disengaged? And I think the answer to that question is outside factors out of their control. I don't think they want to disengage, but I think there are variables that make them disengage or force them out of, social functioning. I think the biggest one that contributes to loneliness is the lack of knowing technology that can enable someone to social network. You see a lot of people not being able to talk to friends, not being able to read about what makes them happy, read about what they're interested in. All these factors could lead to being lonely or self-isolated, which we discussed in the presentation, could lead to major health risks and death. So in conclusion, I'd like to say, please be patient when helping an older individual learn how to text, learn how to use email, or learn how to use Facebook. You're not only making their lives easier, you might be saving it. Thank you for watching my presentation on modern technology and aging populations. Have a good day.